the American military has its sights set on Iran once again. We examine the media messages around the story, including one that does not stand up to scrutiny, that the Islamic Republic is a nuclear menace.
More than a friend, a brother.
Brothers in arms and ethno-supremacy. India's Prime Minister travels to Israel to embrace the Netanyahu government. And spreading the word of a Christian God, hoping it gets them to the political promised land. Brazil and the evangelical influencers looking to take power. For more than a week now, the United States has been threatening military action against Iran. Deadlines have been floated, consequences threatened, and yet, at the time of this recording, no shots have been fired, missiles launched, or bombs dropped. The negotiations continue over the future of Iran's nuclear program, which, if the Trump administration is to be believed, is at the core of this dispute. Not Israel, which has long wanted to take down the leaders of the Islamic Republic, not oil, which Iran has an abundance of, and not the Epstein files, which Donald Trump keeps deflecting attention away from. 20-odd years ago, Americans were told that another oil-rich state in the region, Iraq, posed a clear and present danger. We know how that ended. This time around, Tehran's reply has been telling. The Iranian media, which are mostly state-controlled, have been focusing on the Epstein scandal, reminding the world that one of the reasons that President Trump is talking tough abroad may be because he is under the gun at home.
President Trump is putting the pressure on Iran.
It's going to be a bad day for Iran, very bad.
The administration has been really vague on what its objectives are. The reason for that is they themselves don't know what their objectives are.
A lot of this is that Donald Trump is making it up as he goes along.
I will never allow the world's #1 sponsor of terror, which they are by far, to have a nuclear weapon.
I think Donald Trump is a little high on his own supply right now.
So we could be sleepwalking into this conflict that could have potentially huge ramifications, not unlike the Iraq War, and potentially even worse.
If you've been tracking the news on Iran, finding it difficult to get a grip on the story, you are not alone. Between the rhetoric coming out of Washington, the military buildup, the nuclear angle, the latest protests in Tehran, the negotiations taking place in Geneva, and the journalistic tendencies of Western media outlets, news consumers are up against it. And there is a lack of coherence combined with an eerie familiarity in the White House's messaging on the supposed threat that Iran poses, in that Iran's nuclear program has been weaponized, but by Washington, in the same way that Iraq's WMDs, its non-existent weapons of mass destruction, were post 9/11. The Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, has been warning of the impending threat of Iranian nukes for decades.
If this regime were to acquire nuclear weapons, this could presage catastrophic consequences. Time is running out.
He has repeatedly described the danger as more and more imminent.
It's only a few months, possibly a few weeks, before they get enough enriched uranium for the first bomb.
One would think Netanyahu would have been relieved last June, after the 12-day war that the U.S. and Israel launched on Iran, when President Trump declared that Iran's nuclear weapons ambitions were done for.
Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
Yet, there was Trump at the State of the Union address this week, saying the nuclear threat was somehow back.
We're starting it all over. We wiped it out and they want to start all over again.
The thing about propaganda, however, it's not supposed to be this confusing.
It is clear that Iran's nuclear program does not pose an imminent threat to anyone. The military dimensions of its nuclear program, according to U.S. intelligence itself, was abandoned several years ago. What it is doing is what we call hedging. It's amassing all the necessary raw materials in order to make a dash for a bomb, should it one day make the political decision to do so. But there is nothing that indicates that Iran has made that political decision today.
Iran's nuclear program is being used very similarly to how Iraq's supposed WMD program was used in 2002. A supposed threat that is hyped with misinformation. You can have Witkoff say,
they're probably a week away from having industrial-grade bomb-making material.
Journalists need to say, well, how do we know that? We don't have inspectors on the ground. And I think we would find that this is just empty rhetoric. Facts just really don't matter anymore.
What nuclear program are they talking about? That American political commentator, Mark Levin, he had written Iranians are going to have biological and chemical warheads on their ballistic missiles. Oh, come on. So nuclear warheads are now out of the game, and now biological or chemical weapons have come out. It is exactly the scenario that was used for Iraq, and everybody knows it.
They believe today that they must destroy the West. Those nuclear ICBMs aren't aimed for Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. They're aimed for New York and Los Angeles and Chicago.
This is the sort of propaganda that has been going on for at least 3 decades. And the good thing is that on social media, people have woken up, and I say, you are looking for an excuse, for a justification to attack that country.
Nevertheless, the war hawks seem to have the upper hand in Washington and the ear of the White House. They are backed by some well-funded, influential elements of the Iranian diaspora, voices advocating the overthrow of Iran's leaders and the installation of Reza Pahlavi, the exiled son of the former Shah. That diaspora is in temporary cahoots with an even better-funded pro-Israel lobby, which argues that given the recent anti-government protests in Iran, now is the time to strike.
Iran is as weak as we can remember.
The Pentagon would beg to differ, as evidenced by some clearly coordinated leaks this past week to 3 major U.S. news outlets, all of which headlined the risks that an attack on Iran would create.
When these leaks have come out, Donald Trump's been very fast to go up on Truth Social and to say, no, there's nothing to worry about here. This is a complete lie. We have the most powerful military in the world. So I think it's very much a matter of managing that media narrative. But the president has backed himself into a corner in part by laundering this through the media, where the expectation is now he has to strike because he has hyped it up so much.
It's critical for Trump's generals to be able to outline what the risks are.
Attack on Iran as a...
What is more interesting is the scale and the timing of the leak. The fact that every major news outlet came across this information, and the fact that every major news outlet wrote about it because people within the US administration are worried about such a military campaign. So they are choosing to notify the public so that the public could restrain the president.
The leaks are highly significant, given that there is a broad perception in Washington that a war with Iran could be low cost.
Yeah, President Donald Trump's top general is highlighting the potential risks with striking Iran.
We saw that with the June war, the U.S. just went in for a one-and-done strike where he claimed that they obliterated the nuclear program. But now Trump has amassed this massive military force, threatening a big war.
If Donald Trump has cranked up tensions over Iran in order to divert attention away from the Epstein files, the poisonous effect those lurid revelations have had on his administration, Tehran refuses to play along. While Western news organizations do seem distracted, focusing on all the military hardware heading for the Middle East, Iranian outlets are keeping the Epstein story front and center. The Islamic Republic's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, has done his part, describing Epstein Island as a symbol of Western decay, framing the Epstein story, for which not a single U.S. political figure has taken the fall, as proof of what he calls the moral collapse of liberal democracy. And social media there is pulling no punches, branding the Trump administration the Epstein regime.
The Iranian media, they thoroughly covered the story. And whenever a new batch of Epstein file is released, they show them to people. And Iran's leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, in his recent speech, he also referred to Epstein, that President Trump had links with Epstein.
هرچی درباره فساد اینا شنیده بودیم یک طرف، این قضیه این جزیره بدنام و فاسد هم یک طرف. اینا در واقع نشون دهنده تمدن غرب.
They tell people, look, these are a bunch of perverts, pedophiles, who are now trying to cover their own scandals by opening a new field, which is a war on Iran.
When it comes to the Epstein files, the Iranian government has tried to capitalize on that in its own propaganda efforts against the United States. They made a big deal out of, in these recent rallies for the anniversary of the Iranian Revolution.
اگر این اتفاق ذره‌ایش 1% در ایران اتفاق 1% در ایران اتفاق افتاده بود اون رو پیرهن عثمان می‌کردن و این اتفاقی که
For Trump, whether or not the Epstein files are the main driver for him seeking a war against Iran, that's unclear, but they are definitely trying to capitalize on this in their own propaganda, in their own kind of disinformation efforts.
That's the other thing about propaganda. Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, it turns out to be true. Prime Minister Narendra Modi sent a clear signal this past week that India stands with Israel. His visit to the country was just the second by an Indian Prime Minister. The first took place 9 years ago. It was Modi then, too. Tarak Nafa has been following how the trip unfolded.
Narendra Modi's visit this week was a carefully choreographed display of solidarity.
Narendra, my dear friend, these are not just words. I would almost venture to say, more than a friend, a brother.
The Indian Prime Minister was presented with a newly created state honor, and he delivered an address to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset.
Let us ensure that the friendship between India and Israel remains a source of strength in an uncertain world.
Ahead of the trip, the Jerusalem Post ran a front-page welcome for Modi with a hello in Hindi. Television networks in both countries went all in on the celebratory atmosphere.
प्रधानमंत्री नरेंद्र मोदी ने इजराइल जाते ही धूम मचा दी। वहां की सरकार, वहां की संसद, पूरा इजराइल नरेंद्र मोदी के स्वागत में बिछा हुआ है।
לא בכל יום מגיע לכאן אחד המנהיגים החשובים בעולם.
Back in India, opposition politicians and activists criticized the visit. The Modi government brushed that aside, but did react to critical reporting. It ordered the ex-account of journalist and author Azad Issa to be withheld in India. Issa has written extensively about New Delhi's ties with Tel Aviv. Those ties now run even deeper as a result of this visit. Modi and Prime Minister Netanyahu signed agreements to boost already significant military partnerships and joint weapons manufacturing deals. For Netanyahu, this visit could not have come at a better time. Israel faces growing international isolation over its genocidal war and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. India's unwavering support for the country allows him to project an image of strength.
אתה התייצבת בצורה כל כך ברורה, כל כך מוסרית, כל כך חדה. התייצבת לצד ישראל. You didn't flinch, you didn't waver, you didn't give excuses.
This was a visit loaded with symbolism, a relationship reinforced through lucrative arms deals, and a meeting of two leaders with a shared worldview, an ethno-religious vision for their countries.
Thanks, Tarak. It has been nearly 2 years now since Jair Bolsonaro fell from power in Brazil, yet the political turmoil that he unleashed is still having an effect. Bolsonaro's policies mixed law and order with some Christian principles selectively applied. He is now in prison for plotting a military coup, and the right-wing movement that he started finds itself adrift. Potential successors are vying to inherit Bolsonaro's spot. They tend to be young, evangelical, and hyper-online. Brazil's evangelical movement has spent decades messaging through the media. What began with radio broadcasts of sermons, then preaching the word through gospel TV, has grown into a sprawling social media machine. Fronted by young evangelical politicians who are adept at creating viral content that ricochets across social feeds, mobilizing followers and voters in ways that old-school politicians cannot match. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on Brazil's evangelical influencers and the political space they're looking to take over.
Eu acredito que literalmente aborto é sacrifício de crianças. Tá, mas como assim um sacrifício? Povos pagãos sacrificavam bebês aos deuses para melhorar suas vidas. Ah, eu já li sobre isso. Inclusive, está escrito na Bíblia que os cananeus sacrificavam seus filhos e filhas em troca de dinheiro e prosperidade.
The man behind the sketch is 27-year-old Brazilian Lucas Pavanato. On the surface, he looks like a digital influencer with faith-forward content.
Por isso nós estamos aqui hoje na Avenida Paulista para ver o que as pessoas pensam a respeito de Jesus e da Páscoa.
But Pavanato isn't just performing for clicks. He's an evangelical politician who was the most voted candidate in Brazil's 2024 municipal elections. He belongs to the Partido Liberal, the party once led by former President Jair Bolsonaro, now the backbone of Brazil's far-right opposition. And he isn't alone. Fellow Partido Liberal MPs Nicolás Ferreira and Ana Carolina Campagnolo cut similar figures online. Young, ultra-conservative evangelicals with millions of followers across their platforms. Together, they represent a new hybrid. Politicians who communicate like digital influencers.
Porque quando a serpente encontra Eva e quer propor a ela o primeiro pecado, o pecado original, a desobediência, a serpente questiona o que Deus disse.
And sermonize like New Age televangelists.
Que cada vez mais é necessário a gente, sabe, ir nos purificando e, sabe, penetrando mais denso ainda.
Quando nós olhamos assim.
When we look at the social media of these three people, it's difficult to distinguish between the politician, the religious figure, and the digital influencer. This makes sense given that this is exactly what their political strategy is, to navigate these disparate worlds. It's a strategy that takes place especially within the right wing and the far right. It's a new communications trend within Brazilian politics.
Na política brasileira. Então elas emulam muito o discurso.
And what we notice in these three figures is the way that they emulate pastoral speeches and preach to their followers that a good Christian should be doing what the Bible says.
E para isso eu já te peço duas coisas. Primeiro, para que você tenha a sua Bíblia em mãos. Todos os dias aqui você vai ter a sua Bíblia em mãos.
That's known as dominionism, a brand of theology that maintains that believers should govern society according to biblical principles. And they have all been able to grasp very well the concept of being against the liberal status quo, pressing those moral panic alarm buttons.
Essas mulheres aqui que estão comemorando a morte de crianças no ventre, quando eu falo para você que esse é o movimento, né, o maior movimento genocida do mundo.
Against abortion, drugs or feminism.
Quero te contar episódio real de duas feministas mentirosas.
They have mastered certain online communication tools that old school televangelists only started using much later.
Depois.
Brazil's televangelists have been refining this ultra-conservative message for decades.
Deus, quando fez o homem e fez essa terra, ele fez tudo perfeito. Quem corrompeu isso foi o homem, desobedecendo a Deus.
Their churches didn't just preach, they built a parallel media universe, radio pastors, gospel pop stars, even primetime soap operas. And today, Brazil's second largest television network, Record TV, is owned by an evangelical bishop, Edir Macedo. It's a media ecosystem that fuses celebrity status with religious authority, and it's now being spearheaded by digital natives like Pavanato, Ferreira, and Campagnolo, who understand that faith can be turned into political currency, and their ranks are growing.
Durante todo o século XX,
the 21st century saw a very strong presence of evangelical figures in the media, and new ones keep appearing. Figures like Raquel Lima.
Milagres que eu via na Bíblia, milagres que eu lia na Bíblia, né? E eu vejo nos meus olhos.
She's a pastor and radio producer from Sao Paulo who has a lot of influence. If you imagine someone who works as a concierge in a tower block, they spend the whole night sitting there in reception listening to her. And what's interesting is that the production of podcasts and web-based TV has led to increased evangelical content, given that people can make an internet show with just a mobile phone.
Pessoas podem produzir o segundo canal mais popular.
The second most popular YouTube channel in Brazil belongs to an evangelical bishop, Bruno Leonardo.
Bom dia, que Deus e o céu te guardem.
He's an emissary delivering a message to his supporters, but in the evangelical churches, There is no pope to tell you what to say. The message can be readily customized. Anybody can adapt it to whatever their need is, however they want to. So Nicolais, Anna Carolini and Lucas have all been very good at understanding this and converting it into political capital.
These influencers inherited an audience that had already been primed to receive their political message by the former president. When Jair Bolsonaro emerged as a national political figure, evangelicals recognized an ideology that chimed with their theology, Bolsonarismo, built around traditional family values, nationalism, and religion. Prominent televangelists opened their platforms to Bolsonaro. In return, they gained political backing. For the first time in Brazil's history, evangelicals, now more than a quarter of the population, became an electoral force that could not be ignored. And the alliance forged through media, faith and mutual advantage helped Bolsonaro gain and sustain the support of nearly 70% of Brazil's evangelicals.
Traditionally, the big figures in the evangelical community in Brazil would always support those in power. What started to happen in the 2010s is evangelicals would pick a political side that would better represent their ultra-conservative values. Bolsonaro, who was a federal congressman at the time, understood that evangelicals would back whoever really put their conservative values at the forefront of their political agenda for Brazil. So when he entered the presidential race, he associated himself with various evangelical figures who are all quite dominant, both in terms of their media presence as well as their ideals.
This all led to the building of very close ties between Bolsonaro and the evangelical community, relationships which were nurtured. Bolsonaro was seen at church and in religious media. Figures in the evangelical media sphere, such as Edir Macedo or Silas Malafaia, strengthened their public image amongst evangelicals by aligning their own profiles with that of Bolsonaro.
Outside their own media ecosystem, evangelical voices are largely sidelined by Brazil's mainstream media. They are rarely seen as serious religious and political actors, or as the growing constituency they represent. That underrepresentation says less about the media's oversight and more about where Brazil's evangelical audience is headed. With nearly 8 in 10 Brazilians getting their information primarily online, the evangelical digital space is getting bigger and more politically relevant. And the message sent by dominating figures of this space is clear. Command the feed, and you command the vote.
Lula's administration is looking for online-based communication that can connect with the public in the way Pavanato, Ferreira and Campagnolo do. The Office for Communications was even reformed in 2024, precisely to engage with the general public online. Lula is somewhat of an analog figure. These political influencers, they're showing you how they have lunch. And next thing you see is them launching into a tirade against feminists. They've managed to bring the aesthetics of online communication into the political sphere.
All those people who are glued to the internet, watching videos on their feed, no longer depend on the mainstream media. So now we have this ready-made online ecosystem, and evangelical right-wing influencers are being replicated. You even start seeing influencers who've moved into the evangelical ecosystem and who are using evangelical discourse to acquire political power. Voices who can form a conservative cluster of considerable political strength. They have really high-flying objectives. They want to go all the way to the presidency.
And finally, U.S. Democrats held a press conference just prior to Donald Trump's State of the Union speech this week, alongside about a dozen survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's sex trafficking ring. They were there to put pressure on the president.
Today, the world will see Donald Trump have to face these survivors right there in the House gallery.
One example of an Epstein connection who has faced little accountability, Trump's Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick, who lied about his ties to Epstein. He then attended the speech, shaking hands with people. Last November, more than 500 members of Congress voted to pass a new law compelling the Department of Justice to release all the Epstein files. Just one congressman voted against it. Donald Trump then signed the bill, making it the law. But more than 3 million files remain sealed by the DOJ. And in his 1 hour and 48-minute speech, Trump steered clear of the topic, which, given that his name comes up thousands of times in the files that have been released, is no surprise.
Members of Congress, the state of our union is strong.
What remains to be seen in an increasingly authoritarian America. Will the media keep pressuring the White House to do what the law demands and release those files? That will tell us much more than a marathon speech ever will about the real state of that union.